Rain had soaked through Barbara Nielsen's stockings before dawn, and by the time the stagecoach cleared the second mile beyond Bath, she could no longer feel two of her toes, only the dull shock in her ankle each time the wheel struck a rut and she was forced to limp faster to keep level with the door. She carried 2 hat boxes on her left arm, a travelling brazier balanced against her hip on the right, and the narrow leather strap had already worn the skin at the base of her thumb open. Blood marked the polished side of the lower hat box in faint red crescents that the rain thinned and spread. She kept her shoulders level because Mrs. Nielsen watched for any sway that might crush the ribboned brim inside the upper case. She kept her face still because the footman had not come and there was no one to receive blame except her. The horses steamed in the dark. Mud splashed cold to her knees. The coach lantern threw weak yellow light over the road, enough to show strangers what was happening and not enough to make any one of them intervene. Inside the carriage, 3 paid seats held Mrs. Nielsen and her daughters, Clara and Edith, wrapped in wool travelling mantles with fur at the cuffs, their gloved hands warm around silver-topped flasks. The 4th seat remained empty except for parcels and a lap rug folded twice over, and each time Barbara glanced toward the glass, she saw the vacant corner as clearly as a spoken insult. When the coach slowed at a rise, a merchant riding opposite lifted the blind and looked directly at her through the rain. His gaze moved from her bare head to the brazier, to the blood on the leather, then away to the hedges, as though weather had become abruptly interesting. A clergyman in a black coat cleared his throat and did not meet her eye. Clara laughed once, not loudly, at something Edith whispered, and the sound carried through the vent above the door like cut glass. Barbara lowered her chin and shifted the weight again. Her fingers had gone stiff around the handles. The skin across her knuckles had split where lye and winter water had left it thin, and now rain entered each crack with a sting that climbed to her wrists. The road smelled of wet straw, horse sweat, and coal smoke from cottages not yet awake. Hunger pulled low in her belly, and then sharpened, a familiar blade turned by movement. She had been given half a heel of bread before they set out, with instructions to eat quickly in the yard where no one would see, and the bread had tasted of old flour and damp cloth. She had swallowed it standing. She had thanked Mrs. Nielsen for it. She had learned that gratitude shortened punishments by minutes, sometimes by hours, and those fragments of time were all she owned. At the 3rd toll gate the guard called for a brief halt, and Barbara nearly stumbled when she stopped moving, her muscles locking from the sudden change. She set the brazier down on the packed mud with care and flexed her hands against the pane. Mrs. Nielsen opened the coach door just far enough to lean out, silk rustling under her travelling cloak, rosewater cutting through the smell of wet leather. Even in dim light she looked arranged, her bonnet ties dry, her mouth composed in that careful line she used in company and at church, and while denying Barbara supper. "Do not set that in water," she said, glancing at the brazier as if it were an heirloom instead of iron. "If rust appears, it will be taken from your wages." Barbara had no wages. Mrs. Nielsen used the phrase often, and always in public, because it made the arrangement sound respectable. Clara peered over her mother's shoulder and wrinkled her nose. "She has stained my hat box," she said. "Look at the handle," Edith added with practised sweetness. "Barbara does not notice such things." Barbara bent, wiped the leather with the edge of her apron, and said, "Yes, Mrs. Nielsen." Her voice came out rough from cold. She cleared it once and added, "I will clean it properly at the inn." Mrs. Nielsen's eyes moved over her face, over the wet strands of dark hair pasted at her throat, over the hollow above her collarbone where the dress no longer fit, and paused there not with pity, but with assessment. "Stand straight," she said. "People are watching." Barbara obeyed. The guard swung down, shouted to the driver, and the coach jolted forward again before she had fully lifted the brazier. The iron edge struck her hip. Pain flashed and settled. She walked. By the 4th mile marker, the sky had lightened from black to a colourless grey that flattened everything it touched. Hedges, ditches, milestones, the line of her own hand when she lifted it to wipe rain from her lashes. Barbara had been told plain so often that the word had begun to sound like law. Yet the road offered no mercy to faces and no deference to judgment. It showed only facts. Her dark hair, unpowdered and heavy with rain, clung in a long rope down her back. Her eyes looked larger in hunger, ringed with the sleepless bruise of blue beneath them. Her face had gone narrow over the last 2 years, its softness stripped by cold attics, skipped meals, and work done before sunrise. She had learned stillness as others learned embroidery. No flinch when a cup was thrown. No intake of breath when a pin was set too hard while fastening another woman's gown. No complaint when hot water was withheld and she was sent to scrub linen in rain barrels with hands already raw. Captain Nielsen had once said that her hands were made for violin strings, quick and precise, and had laughed when she corrected his column totals at 13. That had been before the storm that took his ship and before paper debts appeared like a second tide, each one stamped and witnessed and indifferent to grief. Within a year of his burial, her mother was gone as well, and Mrs. Nielsen had taken charge of the household books, with a voice full of duty and a key ring at her waist. The violin went first, sold quietly to settle a draper's account. The winter cloak followed, then the silver buttons from her father's great coat, then 3 servants dismissed and their wages absorbed into the fiction that the family remained genteel. Barbara could still read account ledgers at a glance. She could still total freight losses in her head, faster than most clerks. She could still translate French invoices without a dictionary. None of these skills bought her a seat in a paid coach. None of them prevented Mrs. Nielsen from saying in front of neighbours that Barbara should be grateful she had not been sent into service. She walked in the rain beside her own family carriage and carried their comfort in both hands. Near midday the downpour eased to a hard mist, and the road widened where a line of elms gave way to common ground trampled by carts and drovers. They passed 2 farm wagons, a post rider with his collar turned high, and a widow in a plain bonnet who stared at Barbara's bare forearms and then looked quickly at the sky, lips pressed thin. Witnesses were everywhere. Assistance was nowhere. When the coach hit a deep rut, the upper hat box slipped and knocked her shoulder so sharply that white light burst behind her eyes. She caught it before it fell. The brazier tilted, hot ash from the banked coals shifting inside with a metallic hiss. She steadied it against her ribs and tasted iron at the back of her throat. "Faster," Mrs. Nielsen called through the half-open window without lifting her voice. "We are late already." Barbara tried to lengthen her stride and felt her left shoe give at the sole. Cold water rushed in again, immediate and complete. Her teeth clicked once, then stopped. She fixed her gaze on the rear wheel hub and matched its rhythm, step and drag, breathing through her mouth so the air would not cut as deeply. By the time the first sign for Marlborough came into view through the mist, her apron was crusted with mud from hem to waist, her sleeves clung to her skin, and both arms trembled from the weight she had not set down in an hour. The coach slowed for the turn toward the posting inn. Mrs. Nielsen did not look out this time. Clara and Edith were arguing over which room had the better light. Barbara lowered her head against the wind, tightened her grip on leather and iron, and kept pace beside the wheel, as though the road itself had issued the command. The coach rolled under the inn arch at last, wheels grinding over broken stone, and the sudden shelter of the yard roof made the rain strike louder on the tiles above, while steam rose off the horses in pale sheets. Barbara moved on reflex, setting the brazier down where the ash would not scatter, lifting the hat boxes before anyone asked, stepping aside so Mrs. Nielsen could descend without wetting her hem. The inn-yard smelled of dung, hot metal, spilled ale, and the bitter vinegar used to scrub stable boards. Men crossed the cobbles with sacks on their shoulders. 2 maids hurried past with pails, skirts pinned high from the mud. No one stopped. No one offered to carry what she carried, though several looked, and looking was enough to fix the scene in public memory. 3 ladies in dry wool and 1 young woman with mud to her waist and blood dried in the lines of her hands. Mrs. Nielsen accepted the ostler's bow as though they had arrived in complete order. "Private parlour." "Fire lit," she said, "and send hot water at once." She turned to Barbara without lowering her voice. "Do not drip near the front stair. Use the service entrance." Clara was already removing her gloves, complaining that the road had shaken her head loose from her pins. Edith touched the edge of the lower hat box, found the faint stain Barbara had failed to erase in the rain, and gave a small sigh meant to be overheard. "She ruins the finish on everything she touches." Barbara kept her chin level and followed them with the luggage until the polished floor of the front corridor ended and the stone flags of the back passage began. Her wet shoe left a dark print at every step. A kitchen boy stared at her ankles and then at the fine ribbon on Clara's bonnet, and stared again, learning in a glance how rank could be worn and how labour could be made invisible while still standing in plain sight. Barbara set the boxes where she was told, returned for the brazier, returned for the shawl case, returned for the parcel basket, and each crossing of the yard dragged memory after it like a net. She had entered this same inn once at 12 with Captain Nielsen's hand warm at her shoulder, when the stable lads had run to take his trunks, and he had laughed that she marched like a quartermaster. He had ordered hot broth for her before ordering his own supper. He had tipped the maid who brought it and asked her name. She could still hear his voice over the clatter of plates, patient even when tired, reading freight numbers from a folded letter and letting Barbara correct his addition in the margin. "Do it again," he had said then, smiling into his beard. "If you are right twice, you shall keep my books when I am old." He had not grown old. By the autumn after his ship went down west of Ushant, his handwriting survived only in ledgers and on one salt-stiff chart Mrs. Nielsen had used to wrap candlesticks for sale. She carried a coal scuttle to the private parlour and found her stepmother already seated nearest the fire, boots removed, stockings stretched to the grate by a maid who knelt on a rug too fine for service work. Clara and Edith had taken the 2 better chairs and spread their damp cuffs over the carved arms, as if drying silk were an emergency and the girl shivering in the doorway were a draught. "Set it there," Mrs. Nielsen said, pointing with 2 fingers to a place precisely far enough from the hearth that Barbara would not feel the warmth. "Then ask for tea. China, not pewter." Barbara obeyed. When she turned to go, Mrs. Nielsen added, "And see whether they have mutton for dinner. Not the joint near the bone. Ask in French if the cook is foreign. They are less careless when spoken to properly." The words struck with familiar double edge. Command and reminder. Use your skill. Remember it is not yours. Barbara dipped her head and left, aware of Clara watching her back with a look she had worn since girlhood, that careful contempt reserved for someone whose usefulness had become an irritation. In the passage, she paused with one hand against the wall, while pain climbed from her ankle to her knee in a slow, hot line. The wall plaster had cracked where damp had entered and refrozen. Her fingers settled in the crack as if it were a seam she had mended before. She could not stand still for long. Stillness had cost too much in Nielsen House. When work slowed, punishment found fresh shape. Silver to polish again because one spoon held a thumb mark. Linen to rinse again because one cuff was not white enough. Stair rods to scrub on bare knees because Clara had seen dust where no dust lay. Mrs. Nielsen called it discipline in front of callers and economy in front of tradesmen. She called it kindness in church. She called Barbara ungrateful whenever anyone asked why a daughter of the house answered the kitchen bell. The cruelty did not arrive as blows alone, though blows came when doors were shut and witnesses absent. It arrived in portions too small to report and too constant to escape. Half portions at meals while guests praised Mrs. Nielsen's management. A new shawl for Edith made from wool that had lined Barbara's winter cloak. Hours at the wash copper until her hands cracked, then laughter when she failed to thread a needle cleanly by candlelight. The violin sold without notice, and the empty space in the attic where its case had sat for 9 years. "You are too old for childish noise," Mrs. Nielsen had said that day, turning the key in the cabinet where receipts were kept. "Music does not pay interest." Barbara had said nothing because she had already seen the draper's bill and the red mark beside the date. She had known which object would vanish next. She had known because she had balanced the same columns at 16 while Mrs. Nielsen entertained in the drawing-room, translating French cargo terms from Captain Nielsen's old correspondence to prove a claim on a shipment the insurers had denied. She had done the work by firelight with ink that froze in the nib, and when the figures held, she had left the corrected sheet on Mrs. Nielsen's desk. By morning the sheet was gone, the claim was filed under Mrs. Nielsen's name, and Barbara was told in front of Clara and Edith that meddling with account books was forward behaviour in unmarried women. The kitchen heat struck her face when she entered, thick with onion steam and roasting fat, and for one wavering moment the smell made her stomach twist so sharply that she had to grip the edge of the dresser to keep from bending. Cook glanced up, took in Barbara's soaked sleeves and shaking hands, and said nothing, only jerked her chin toward the tea caddy, as if that had always been where a girl in a threadbare dress belonged. Barbara measured leaves into the pot, counted cups, requested mutton in careful French for the undercook's benefit, and earned a startled blink that carried something close to respect before it was masked. Respect changed little. The tray still weighed what it weighed. The stair still climbed as steeply. She carried tea and thin bread to the parlour, then carried the empty cups back, then returned to brush mud from the family's hems, where it had dried in dark fans along the silk. Clara complained that the brushing pulled at the thread and told Edith, loud enough for the corridor, that Barbara's hands were fit for scrubbing pans and little else. Edith replied that Barbara ought to be grateful to remain under their roof at all. "Many girls in her position are sent out," she said. "Mother is generous." Barbara kept the brush, moving in short strokes, and listened to the language that had framed her life since 17, the language of charity used to disguise extraction. She had no wages, and yet every broken thing would be set against them. She had no dowry, and yet debts contracted before her birth were spoken of as her burden to repay through obedience. She had no room in the front of the house, and yet she was reminded daily that she occupied space that cost money. Captain Nielsen's bond dispute had never settled cleanly. She knew this because she had read the correspondence that survived in a locked dispatch box, each letter a tightening knot of legal phrases and vanished cargo valuations, each demand stamped and witnessed by men who had never seen the sea that killed him. Mrs. Nielsen told neighbours the estate had nearly collapsed under his recklessness, though the ledgers showed loans taken later, signed in a hand too smooth to be his. When Barbara once asked quietly whether the transfer order for the South Field had been entered twice by mistake, Mrs. Nielsen had slapped her so hard her ear rang for 2 days, and then sent her to the pantry without supper for insolence. That had been in March. By June, Clara wore Barbara's mother's pearl comb in her hair. By November, Edith had claimed Barbara's riding habit because the skirt could be altered. The house changed shape around each loss. Rooms closed, fires reduced, servants dismissed and their tasks redistributed downward until Barbara rose in darkness and slept in darkness and crossed every floor of the place before noon. She learned which stairboards announced her step and which did not. She learned to mend kid gloves from the inside so the stitches would not show. She learned to hide bread crusts in her apron seam for mornings when breakfast was withheld. She learned to thank Mrs. Nielsen for correction in front of visitors and to swallow language that burned the tongue. She did not mistake silence for consent. Silence was arithmetic. It measured what could be endured until movement became the only remaining sum. By late afternoon, the rain had thinned to a steady dripping from the eaves, and the inn-yard shifted into that uneasy hour between arrivals, when ostlers changed traces, and travellers waited for fresh teams with impatience already rising in their throats. Mrs. Nielsen decided they would not stay the night. London could still be reached if the roads held. Barbara was sent to settle incidentals at the desk because she could total quickly, and because Mrs. Nielsen disliked being seen near accounts when gentlemen were present. The clerk, a narrow man with ink on both cuffs, pushed the slate toward her and named each charge with practised speed: feed, stabling, private room fire, tea service, 2 extra blankets, 1 broken cup. Barbara repeated the list, corrected a duplication in the feed line, translated a French notation beside the mutton tally, and placed the final figure exactly where it belonged. The clerk looked up then, properly, as if noticing for the first time that the girl in a mended sleeve read better than most men who passed his desk. "You keep books?" he asked. Mrs. Nielsen appeared at Barbara's shoulder before she could answer. Lavender and rosewater cutting through coal smoke, silk whispering like warning. "She copies when told," she said. "Nothing more." Her hand settled lightly on Barbara's upper arm, not hard enough to mark, firm enough to direct, and Barbara felt every finger as if each were a ring of iron. "Bring the wraps. We depart in 10 minutes." Barbara inclined her head, collected the paid receipt, and stepped back into the yard, where dusk had begun to stain the puddles pewter. Her ankle had stiffened from the brief warmth indoors. Pain returned on the first step and settled into a rhythm she knew: carry, set down, lift, carry. She loaded the hat boxes again. She lifted the brazier again. She watched Clara and Edith take their seats and pull lap rugs over their knees, while the 4th seat filled once more with parcels that had room where she did not. As the driver gathered reins, a stable hand crossed behind her with a bucket of water and muttered, not unkindly, "Mind the left wheel, miss, it catches on turns." She gave the smallest nod, surprised by the warning, surprised by the courtesy of being addressed as if she possessed a body worth protecting. Then the whip cracked in the damp air. The horses lunged forward, and Barbara matched the wheel's pace into the deepening road, carrying the same iron and leather, carrying also the full weight of years that had taught her exactly what waiting in obedience would cost. The coach had scarcely cleared the inn arch when a shout split the yard from the stable side, sharp enough to cut through rain and harness noise alike, and the left horse threw its head so hard the traces snapped tight with a crack. Barbara saw the cause in one flashing sequence. A figure in dark blue livery ran across the cobbles with a document case clutched against his chest. His boot hit the slick lip of a drain channel. He fell forward under the pole, shoulder striking stone, the case skidding beneath the near wheel. The driver hauled the reins. The horses screamed and stamped. Clara cried out from inside the carriage, angry rather than frightened. Edith demanded that someone move the fool from the road. Mrs. Nielsen leaned to the window and said, with perfect annoyance, "Do not stand idle, Barbara. Lift that brazier. We depart now." Barbara had already dropped both hat boxes. The lower one burst open on impact, feathers and ribbon darkening in muddy water. She did not look at it. She set the brazier clear with one hand, gathered her skirt with the other, and went down to her knees beside the fallen boy as the wheel groaned inches from his gloved wrist. Rain blew under the arch in cold sheets, flattening her hair against her cheek and running from her jaw to her collar. The boy's breath came fast and broken. He was unmistakably underage, no more than 14, face pale under the brim of his cap, jaw clenched against pain, one trouser leg torn where iron had scraped him. No blood spilled in any dramatic flood, only a dark, wet line and the stiff, instinctive way he held himself, trying not to move and failing. Men crowded and shouted uselessly. An ostler swore at the horses. The clerk from the desk appeared with his pen still in his hand, as if ink might settle the matter. Barbara reached for the torn cloth, pressed where she knew pressure would steady the shaking, and called over her shoulder without rising, "Boiled water, clean linen, now!" No one moved for half a breath. Then cook's kitchen maid ran, pale, sloshing against her skirts. Mrs. Nielsen's voice came again, high and hard from the coach door. "Barbara!" The single word carried every threat she owned. The answer arrived from the opposite side of the yard before Barbara could speak. A carriage door opened with controlled force. Boots hit stone. The sound carried through rain and shouting with the certainty of rank. He crossed the cobbles directly, coat dark with water at the shoulders, hat brim low, height and breadth turning the crowd by simple movement rather than appeal. The crest on the carriage panel behind him was a black falcon over a divided shield. Even in bad light, everyone knew it. The Duke of Hulworth had returned from the Western Circuit a day earlier than expected, and half the yard lowered its gaze on instinct as he came within arm's reach of her. He looked first at the fallen livery boy, then at Barbara's hands, already red from split knuckles and mud, then at the soaked hem clinging to her knees, the yellowing bruise above her cuff where her sleeve had ridden back, the torn edge of her shoe showing through. His face gave nothing. His voice did. "Stop! Not like that!" He crouched without ceremony, took the injured boy's wrist with 2 fingers, then shifted Barbara's hand 2 inches, with a precision so swift it felt like command made physical. "There! Hold! Harder!" She held. His gloves were fine leather, rain beaded along the seams. His jaw looked carved from stone and held just as still. "You," he said to the nearest ostler, without turning his head, "bring a board and blanket. He is not to stand." To the clerk, "Send for the surgeon from High Street. Tell him Halworth summons." To the stable master, "Back those horses! Slow!" Orders ran outward from him and became action at once. The crowd thinned into purpose. The young livery boy groaned once, tried to lift himself, and Barbara pressed him down with the flat of her hand. "Do not move," she said. "You will worsen it." His eyes found hers, frantic, then fixed on her mouth as if her voice were rope. The Duke glanced at her again, quick, assessing, then stripped off one glove and touched the boy's throat, counting pulse under the rain. By the time the courtyard clock struck 6, the yard had rearranged itself around his will. A groom held the horses quiet. 2 men slid aboard under the injured livery boy on Barbara's count. The kitchen maid returned with linen steaming in a basin. Barbara reached for it. Mrs. Nielsen stepped down from the carriage at last. Silk skirts lifted above puddles, rose water and lavender absurd in stable air. "Your Grace," she said with a curtsy timed for witnesses, "my apologies that our servant has involved herself in your affairs. She is impulsive and badly trained." The Duke rose to his full height and looked at Mrs. Nielsen as if she were a line item requiring confirmation. "Your servant," he said. The question was quiet. It chilled more than a raised voice might have done. Mrs. Nielsen smiled the smile she used for magistrates and vicars. "My late husband's daughter. We keep her from hardship, naturally. Barbara, stand up. You have embarrassed us." Barbara did not stand. The boy on the board had begun to shake harder now that stillness was forced on him. She tucked the linen under his calf and tied a pressure wrap with fingers that stung from cold and work. She had done this before for sailors in her father's yard when rope burns turned ugly. She had done it with cleaner hands then, and with someone who thanked her after. A shadow fell across her as the Duke moved 1 step nearer, rain dripping from the brim of his hat to the stone between her knees. "Hold pressure," he said to her, low enough that only she heard the second part. "Look at me, not them." The instruction struck like a hand to the back of her neck. She looked up despite herself. His eyes were not warm, they were grey, deep-set, intent as winter water. He noticed what others skipped. Her hunger, her shaking, her refusal to leave the boy though commanded by her household. She knew better than to mistake observation for mercy. Men with rank observed in order to own the facts before anyone else did. She lifted her chin a fraction and answered with the same clipped precision he had used. "If I lessen pressure, he will faint again." His mouth altered by less than a line. Not a smile, not indifference either. "Then do not lessen it," he said. "Mrs. Nielsen took 1 step forward, scandal bright in her eyes. "Barbara, you will obey me." Barbara kept her hands where they were. Rain ran down her wrist and into the torn cuff. "He requires treatment now, Mrs. Nielsen." It was not defiance shouted for effect. It was a statement of sequence. Need before punishment. The Duke turned his head toward Mrs. Nielsen at last. "She obeys the urgent thing first," he said. "Encourage it." The words landed in the yard like a dropped plate. Clara, still half inside the coach, went very still. Edith stared at Barbara as if seeing her for the first time and despising the sight. Mrs. Nielsen's fingers tightened on her reticule until the silk creased. The surgeon arrived breathless and damp, spectacles fogged, leather case clattering against his knee. He knelt, assessed, nodded once to Barbara's wrap, and told the footman to carry the injured boy to the side room near the kitchen fire. "No fracture if we are fortunate," he muttered. "Deep contusion. He may keep the leg." Barbara exhaled once, controlled and thin. She had not realized she had been holding breath in measured counts. She moved to rise, and pain from her ankle shot up so sharply that her vision narrowed at the edges. Her hand slipped on wet stone. The Duke's bare hand closed around her forearm before she struck the ground. Heat, strength, restraint. He did not pull her close. He only steadied and released when she found her footing. Even that brief contact seemed to echo along her skin with humiliating clarity. "You are limping," he said. "The road is uneven," she replied. "Liar!" The word was soft and exact. "Your left shoe is split. Your knuckles are open. You have a bruise old enough to yellow. The road did not do all of that." Barbara felt the crowd at the edge of hearing, felt Mrs. Nielsen hearing more than she could answer, felt the indecency of being named in public as if she were visible flesh and not useful furniture. Shame burned first. Anger followed, cleaner and hotter. "Your Grace," she said, each syllable balanced. "If you intend an inquiry, choose another hour. A man has just been carried inside because no one stepped quickly enough." His gaze did not move from her face. Rain ticked from the eaves in steady drops. Somewhere a horse stamped and snorted. "I saw who stepped," he said. "I saw who did not." He turned to his valet, who had appeared with a cloak and dry gloves, and spoke without raising volume. "Record the names of everyone present," the valet bowed. "Ink and witness." Barbara understood suddenly that this man did not forget details once noticed. That could save. That could destroy. Mrs. Nielsen recovered her social voice. "Your Grace is generous to take concern in household discipline, but we are delayed and my daughters cannot remain in this weather. Barbara, gather the hat boxes at once." Barbara looked to the broken case in the mud. Feathers pasted flat, ribbon ruined, leather soaked through. The cost would be laid at her feet before supper, if supper came at all. The Duke followed her glance. "Those remain," he said. "My steward will compensate the inn for damage caused during my stop. Your party will wait." Mrs. Nielsen's nostrils flared. "We have pressing engagements in London." He met her without courtesy and without insult, which was worse. "So do I." He removed his hat then, one controlled motion, and rain darkened his hair where it had been sheltered. A pale scar crossed his temple and vanished into the line of his sideburn. War, Barbara thought, or a carriage wreck, or some grief carved into bone. She did not ask. Men in his place wore wounds like titles and expected silence around both. He handed the hat to his valet and spoke again to Barbara, not to Mrs. Nielsen. "Come inside. Wash your hands." Command plain and unsoftened. She looked at her fingers. Mud in the cuticles, blood in the splits. Tremor she had hidden now visible because stillness cost too much energy after shock. "Mrs. Nielsen requires the luggage repacked," she said. "Mrs. Nielsen will wait," he answered. The yard listened. Class rules strained, did not quite break, then shifted enough for everyone to feel it. Barbara stood between carriage and archway, between the woman who controlled her daily bread and the man whose word could alter legal weather with a sentence. Fear twisted low in her stomach, not fear of him alone, fear of consequence after witnesses dispersed and doors closed. She could already hear the private voice that would follow this public pause. Ungrateful, immodest, reckless. She could already feel the slap she had not yet received. Yet the memory of the injured boy's breath evening under her hand held her in place. She had chosen once. She could not pretend she had not. "I will rinse," she said finally. "Then I will return to the yard." His eyes narrowed a fraction, taking the compromise, refusing the surrender. "You will sit by the fire for 10 minutes. She almost laughed, not from humour, but from shock at the audacity of being allotted rest by someone who did not own her hours. She did not laugh. "That is not your decision, Your Grace." The words were out before caution could blunt them. Clara made a sound like a gasp, swallowed halfway. Mrs. Nielsen whispered, furious, "Barbara!" The Duke's expression did not harden. It stilled. "It is, for 10 minutes," he said. "After that, decide whether defiance is worth a torn tendon." He stepped aside then, making space toward the side door as if he expected movement and would not drag it from her. The gesture was small. It felt larger than the yard. Barbara stood in rain, trembling from cold and restraint and the strange new weight of being addressed as if her body's limits mattered to someone with no obligation to care. She looked once toward Mrs. Nielsen, found only polished anger there, then toward the side door where heat leaked in a thin orange line under warped wood. She took one limping step in that direction, her pulse loud in her ears, and the Duke fell into pace beside her with military exactness, close enough that she felt the heat of him through wet wool, distant enough that no one could accuse him of touch. The side door stuck on swollen wood, and Barbara had to shoulder it with her hip, while the Duke held it open from the outer edge, one hand on wet iron, as if he would not cross the threshold before her. Kitchen heat struck her face at once. It smelled of damp wool, tallow, and boiled herbs. The sudden warmth made the pain in her fingers blaze awake. She kept moving because stopping invited shaking. Behind her the Duke said to a maid in a cap gone crooked from haste, "Boiling water, more linen, send for the inn apothecary as well." The maid bobbed and ran. Barbara reached the side room where they had laid the boy on a narrow settle near the hearth. His livery cloak had been cut open to free his leg. Mud streaked his stockings. His lips had gone nearly colourless. The surgeon worked quickly, spectacles pushed high on his nose, and motioned without looking up. "Girl, hold the lamp lower. No, lower. I must see the edge." She took the lamp and knelt. Light fell across the torn flesh at the shin, ugly but clean enough to mend if fever did not take hold. She held still while the surgeon washed grit away and bound the wound with deliberate pressure. The boy bit his sleeve and made only one small sound. Barbara leaned close enough for him to hear through his own breath. "Look at the brass nail above the mantel," she said. "Count to 10, then start again." His eyes found the nail. He counted under his breath in rough whispers. When he faltered, she supplied the next number. The surgeon glanced up once, surprised by the steadiness of her voice, then returned to his work. The Duke stood in the doorway, rain still dark on his coat, hands clasped behind his back now that his immediate commands had been carried out. He watched the surgeon's hands, then the boy's face, then Barbara's. He said nothing. His silence had weight. It pressed on the room harder than speech. A footman entered with a soaked leather document case held away from his body. "Recovered from under the wheel, Your Grace." The Duke took it, checked the seal with a thumb, and set it on the mantel out of the damp. Only then did he ask the surgeon, "Will he keep the leg?" "If the night is kind," the surgeon said. "No fracture. Deep laceration and shock. He must be watched. If fever climbs, we cool him and dose bark. If delirium begins, send for me again." The boy turned his head toward the Duke. "I did not drop it, Your Grace. I held it." The Duke crossed the distance in 2 strides and put his gloved hand briefly over the boy's shoulder, firm and precise. "You did your duty, Ned. Rest now." Ned. A name, not merely a uniform. Barbara noticed the way the boy's breath eased when he heard it. The surgeon tied the final knot and sat back on his heels with a grunt. "He needs quiet, 1 attendant at most. No crowding, no jolting carriage." He rose and began repacking his instruments. "Who watches?" Mrs. Nielsen answered from the corridor before anyone else could speak. "The inn has servants for such tasks. My household departs within the half-hour." She entered in dry silk and displeasure, Clara and Edith behind her, like mirrored disdain. The warmth of the room did not touch them. Mrs. Nielsen's gaze moved from the boy to Barbara's muddied hem and settled there with cold triumph, as if she had been handed evidence. "You have delayed us enough," she said. "Bring the hat boxes upstairs. Clara's ribbon is ruined and you will mend it before we leave." Barbara rose slowly, joints protesting. The surgeon looked between them, uncertain. The Duke did not move from beside the settle. "No one leaves with that team," he said. "The left trace is frayed from the stop. It will be replaced. You remain until morning." Mrs. Nielsen's smile tightened. "Your Grace is considerate, yet we cannot impose." "It is not an invitation," he said. The room held still. Clara looked at the floor. Edith looked at Barbara with bright malice, as if all this inconvenience could be pinned to one person and therefore solved by punishing her. Mrs. Nielsen lowered her lashes in a careful gesture of submission that did not reach her mouth. "As your Grace wishes." She turned to Barbara. "Upstairs, now." Ned made a small, involuntary sound when Barbara stepped back from the hearth. His fingers twitched against the blanket, searching. She saw it. So did the surgeon. "He should not be left with strangers until he wakes properly," the surgeon said. "He is half in shock." Mrs. Nielsen gave a short laugh that was not laughter. "Then let one of his Grace's men sit." The Duke looked at Barbara, not at Mrs. Nielsen. "Can you read Latin?" She hesitated. The question seemed to cross some invisible line. "Yes, Your Grace." "Then you will assist in the apothecary room. Mr. Hale's labels are in Latin, and his apprentice is away." He gestured toward the small shelf where bottles had already been set out. "You will prepare what the surgeon orders. Nothing else." It was an order shaped to look like necessity. It was also a shield. Barbara knew it and hated that she was relieved by it. Mrs. Nielsen's fan snapped open, though there was no heat to justify it. "Barbara is not employed by the inn." "She is employed by urgency," the Duke said, "as we all are." The surgeon, sensing rank and danger, spoke quickly into the silence. "Willow bark infusion at 2-hour intervals if fever rises. Vinegar cloths. Keep him awake at intervals to test sense. If he cannot answer his name, send for me at once." Barbara repeated the instructions exactly. The surgeon's brows lifted. "Good. You listened." "I had reason," she said. Mrs. Nielsen stepped close enough that rose water cut through the room's medicinal smell. Her voice dropped for Barbara alone. "You will account for this insolence later." Barbara held her gaze and answered quietly, "Yes, Mrs. Nielsen." She did not promise obedience. She promised accounting. The distinction was small and dangerous. By the time the courtyard lamps were lit, rain had settled into a fine, relentless drift that blurred the yard beyond the leaded panes. The frayed trace had been removed and replaced. The coach stood dark and motionless under the arch, departure postponed by authority no one dared challenge. In the apothecary closet off the kitchen, Barbara stood at a narrow table with a mortar, a candle, and 3 bottles labelled in cramped Latin script. Her hands had been washed at last. Clean water had stung each crack like salt, and now thin strips of linen wrapped her knuckles. She read, measured, and stirred while steam fogged the glass. Salix for bark, acetum for vinegar, tinctura opii locked and untouched. Mr. Hale, the inn apothecary, peered at her from over a pair of weak spectacles. "Most gentlewomen cannot tell one from the other," he muttered, not unkindly. "Where did you learn?" "My father kept ship stores," she said. "He taught me not to mistake labels when the sea was rough." He made a small sound that might have been respect. "Then we shall not kill the lad by ignorance tonight." She carried the first cup to Ned at 8 o'clock. He swallowed obediently, face pinched, then drifted again. She cooled his forehead with vinegar cloths and checked the wrap for seepage. The bandage held. The pulse at his wrist still raced. At 9, Clara sent a maid to demand Barbara upstairs for mending. Barbara returned the answer through the same maid, careful and formal. "Inform Miss Clara that the surgeon's instruction binds me to the patient." The maid returned 20 minutes later with Edith's lace cuff and the same demand. Barbara folded the cuff untouched and sent it back. At 10, Mrs. Nielsen came herself, silk whispering across the threshold. "You test me in public and think there will be no private cost," she said. Ned stirred, eyes opening on panic. Barbara leaned and smoothed the blanket at his chest. "Ned, you are at Marlborough Inn. Your leg is bound. You are safe." His gaze found her, and steadied enough to breathe, Mrs. Nielsen waited until his eyes closed again. "Do not pretend concern for him. You seek attention." Barbara wrung out the cloth and laid it over Ned's brow. "He is 14. That is not an argument." "It is." Mrs. Nielsen's face changed, not loudly, but in that precise way Barbara feared most, the shift from social mask to private intent. "When we return to Nielsen House, you will not leave the laundry wing for a month, except by my leave." Barbara did not look up. "If we return tomorrow, I will complete whatever you assign." Mrs. Nielsen took one sharp step forward, then checked herself as boot steps sounded in the corridor. The Duke's silhouette crossed the doorway and paused, broad shoulders filling the frame for a breath before he moved on without entering. He had seen enough to know they were not alone. Mrs. Nielsen's smile returned instantly, polished as silver. "How devoted she is!" she said, in a brighter voice for the corridor to hear. "Our Barbara always did like to play at usefulness." She left before Barbara could answer. Near midnight the fever came. Ned's skin turned hot under her palm. His breathing shortened. He muttered fragments of stable calls and route numbers, as if still running through rain. Barbara sent for Mr. Hale, increased the interval checks, and began sponging his wrists and neck with cool vinegar water while the next bark dose steeped. Her own back ached from bending. Her ankle throbbed in steady waves. She did not sit longer than a minute at a time. "Mr." Hale returned, blinking sleep away, and confirmed the regimen. "Keep him from drifting too deep," he said. "Talk if you must. He must answer to his name each watch." So she talked. Not nonsense, not comfort she did not feel equal to giving. She told him the sequence of numbers he had counted from the mantel-nail. She had him recite months. She made him repeat his full name and the colour of the Duke's carriage crest. When he failed, she waited and asked again. When he succeeded, she gave him a sip of water and the next instruction. Her voice stayed low and level, the same tone she had used years ago to keep frightened cabin boys still while her father stitched rope burns in a pitching hold. Some time after one, while she ground a fresh measure of bark in the closet, she became aware of a presence in the upper corridor outside the half-open door. She looked up. No one stood at eye level. Then she saw the reflection in the black window glass. The Duke on the stair landing above, one hand on the banister, still as carved slate. He could see the table, her hands, the labels she read aloud to check each measure. He made no sound. He did not descend. He watched as she set the opiate bottle aside, untouched, chose bark again, and wrote the hour marks in Mr. Hale's ledger with a cramped but legible hand. When she carried the cup back to Ned, the landing was empty. Yet she felt observed in the precise, unblinking way she had felt in the yard. Not hunted, witnessed. The distinction unsettled her more. 3 days of road labour had already hollowed her strength by then, and by 2 o'clock the room seemed to tilt whenever she stood too quickly. She braced once against the mantel and waited for the floor to steady. Ned's fever broke not all at once, but degree by degree. Sweat cooled at his temples. His answers sharpened from fragments to full words. At 2:30 he opened his eyes and said clearly, "Ned Carrow, Halworth Messenger, 2nd Yard route." Barbara let out a breath she had been measuring for hours. "Well done," she said. "Now sleep." He frowned through exhaustion. "Will His Grace dismiss me?" "No," she answered. "You kept the case. He said so himself." Ned's fingers loosened in the blanket. Within minutes he slept without muttering. At 4 the rain stopped. The silence after it rang in Barbara's ears. Water dripped from eaves in spaced silver taps. Somewhere in the yard a horse shook its mane and settled. She sat at last on the low stool beside the hearth, shoulders bowed, hands extended toward heat she had not allowed herself earlier. Her knuckles burned under clean bandages. Her skirt had dried stiff with mud. She closed her eyes for 1 count of 10 and opened them again. The Duke entered then, alone, without valet or footman. He crossed to the settle and looked down at Ned's sleeping face, then at the dry cloth folded on the basin rim, then at Barbara's hour marks in the ledger left open on the side table. Dawn had not yet lifted beyond the panes, but the first grey had begun to thin the room's shadows. "Report," he said. "Fever rose at midnight. Bark administered at ordered intervals. Cooling cloths maintained. He answers name and post correctly. Pulse remains fast but regular. No fresh bleeding." Her voice sounded scraped raw from use. His gaze rested on her wrapped hands for 1 breath too long. "You have not slept?" "Neither has he," she said. His mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "You disobeyed 2 summons from your household." "I obeyed the surgeon." "And me?" That she did not answer. It sat between them, too true and too dangerous. He moved to the mantel, took up the recovered document case, and examined the seal again. Intact. He set it back, exactly where it had been. "You can read account columns," he said, almost as if verifying a fact from evidence already gathered, "and Latin dosage notes." "Yes, Your Grace. Who taught you?" "My father, Captain Nielsen." He inclined his head once, acknowledging the name and whatever cargo of debt and ruin followed it. "Go wash and take broth. Return only if you choose." The phrasing caught her off guard. Not an order, a narrow permission shaped like respect. "I choose to finish this watch," she said. He studied her face as if measuring whether choice had been forced out of her, so long it no longer meant what it should. "Very well." He turned to leave, then paused at the doorway without looking back. "When people tell me you are plain, Miss Nielsen, I begin to distrust their eyesight." He left before she could answer, boots fading down the passage, the words remaining like heat after a hand has lifted from skin. At first light the inn woke in layers. Bucket clatter, stable calls, bread carts at the rear gate. Barbara rose from the stool, stiff to the bone, and carried the used basins to the scullery. Steam from the copper clouded the small window above the sink. She scrubbed the cloths, wrung them, and hung them to dry. Her hands shook now that the urgency had eased. She had just stepped back into the corridor with a tray of clean bandages when Mrs. Nielsen appeared from the main stair in a travelling mantle of dark green wool, gloves buttoned, bonnet fresh, as if Dawn existed only to present her orderly. Clara and Edith followed with valises, both bright-eyed from sleep Barbara had not shared. Mrs. Nielsen looked at the tray, then at Barbara's face. "You look indecent," she said softly. "Go and make yourself fit to stand behind us." "I must take these to the side room," Barbara answered. "Ned wakes soon for dressing change." The slap came fast and flat across her cheek, loud in the narrow corridor. The tray lurched in her hands. 1 roll of bandage fell and bounced down 2 steps. Clara flinched. Edith did not. "I did not ask what you must do," Mrs. Nielsen said. "I told you what you will do." Barbara's head rang. Heat spread under her skin where the glove had struck. She did not cry. She set the tray on the nearest side table with deliberate care so nothing else would fall. When she lifted her face, the Duke stood at the far end of the corridor just beyond the turn from the yard passage, motionless in the cold morning light. He had seen the whole exchange. He had seen the whole exchange, and he did not move for 3 breaths. The corridor held the sound of the slap as if plaster could remember. Steam drifted from the scullery door behind Barbara and curled against the colder air from the front stair. Clara stared at the floorboards. Edith watched with bright, hard curiosity. Mrs. Nielsen's gloved hand remained half raised, fingers still shaped by the strike, before she lowered it with deliberate grace and turned toward the Duke as if the moment could be arranged by posture alone. "Your Grace," she said, breath even, voice smooth. "A household correction, nothing more. The girl forgets herself." He crossed the corridor then. Each step landed without haste. He stopped beside the side table where Barbara had set the tray, picked up the fallen roll of bandage from the stair and placed it back with exact care. Only after that did he look at Mrs. Nielsen. "You will not touch her again." No one answered. The words did not rise, they settled. They were quieter than anger and harder to defy. Mrs. Nielsen gave a small, incredulous smile meant for social rooms and weak men. "Your Grace is kind to concern himself, but discipline within my household is not yours," he said. "Not this morning." Colour rose high in her cheeks. "She is fed and housed at my expense. She is clothed by my provision. She is answerable to me." Barbara felt the sting in her face pulse with her heartbeat. She kept her gaze level, not on Mrs. Nielsen, not on Clara's lowered lashes, not on Edith's waiting mouth, on the Duke's cravat knot, on the single raindrop still darkening the wool at his shoulder, on anything that did not ask for tears. His eyes shifted to Barbara's cheek, already reddening under glove marks, then to her wrapped hands, then to the tray of clean dressings. He had looked at those same hands all night across bottles and ledgers and fever water. He spoke without turning. "Miss Nielsen, take the bandages to Ned Carow." Mrs. Nielsen cut in at once. "Barbara will come upstairs." The Duke did not raise his voice. "Miss Nielsen!" Barbara drew one breath that scraped her throat and answered him, not her stepmother. "Yes, Your Grace." She lifted the tray. Her left ankle threatened to buckle at the first step, then held. As she passed, Mrs. Nielsen caught her wrist hard enough to stop her. The grip was hidden by silk sleeve and corridor shadow. Pain shot up Barbara's forearm. She did not flinch. She had spent years learning stillness in smaller prisons than this hallway. "Release her," the Duke said. Mrs. Nielsen did not release at once. She looked up at him, searching for the edge of his patience, perhaps for the shape of rules that would let her keep power while seeming polite. She found nothing useful there. His face remained carved and unreadable. His hand did not go to her wrist. He did not step closer. He simply waited with a stillness that made resistance feel theatrical. Mrs. Nielsen let go. Barbara walked to the side room with the tray balanced against trembling fingers. She heard the Duke behind her, heard silk rustle as Mrs. Nielsen shifted to follow, heard his next words stop that movement as cleanly as a barred door. "You and your daughters will take breakfast in the front parlour. You will remain there." Mrs. Nielsen laughed softly. "On what authority, Your Grace?" "Mine." The side-room door closed on the answer. Ned stirred as she entered, eyes opening to a confused squint. Morning light had strengthened to a thin grey wash over the hearth tiles. The heat had dropped from his skin. The worst was past. Barbara set the tray down, checked the bandage seam, and spoke the familiar sequence in a voice kept steady by practice. "Name: Ned Carow. Post: Halworth Messenger, 2nd Yard Route." He swallowed. "Is he angry?" "No," she said. "He asked for your report at dawn. He called you by name." Ned relaxed into the blanket. She changed the outer dressing while he watched her hands. The cloth came away clean except for a faint stain at one edge. Good. She cleaned the skin around the wound, retied the wrap, and counted his pulse beneath her fingers until the rhythm settled. Bootsteps paused at the threshold. She knew who stood there before she turned. The Duke remained just beyond the line of lamplight, broad shoulders filling the doorway, as if he would not enter until asked. "How is he?" he said. "Improving, fever receded, dressing dry. He answers properly." Ned tried to push up. The Duke lifted one hand. "Down." The command was brief and not unkind. Ned obeyed at once. Barbara gathered the used cloth and reached for the basin. Her cheek burned each time she lowered her head. The Duke's gaze returned there, hardening by degrees she could see and not name. He stepped inside, took the basin from her hands before she could object, and set it on the table by the wall. "Sit," he said. "I can stand." "Sit." She sat, more from the force of his certainty than from consent. He took a folded clean cloth from the tray, dipped it in cool water from the pitcher, wrung it once, and held it out. When she did not take it, he placed it gently against the red mark on her cheek himself. One precise motion, touch brief and controlled. Her skin prickled under the chill and the nearness. He withdrew his hand immediately, as if proximity were a fact to be managed, not indulged. "You will keep that there for a minute," he said. "Swelling worsens if ignored." Ned stared at them from the settle, wide-eyed and silent. Barbara held the cloth where he had placed it. Her pulse hammered so loudly she almost missed his next sentence. "I was on the landing at 1 and again at 2. I saw you read every label aloud before dosing. I saw you refuse the opiate though no one watched you from below. I saw you write the hours in Hale's ledger." She lowered the cloth a fraction. "Why were you watching?" "To know whether I could trust the hands treating my messenger. And now I know." The answer carried no softness. It carried weight, trust from a man who spoke in orders and measured men in outcomes. She felt it strike somewhere deeper than praise would have reached. By the time the breakfast bell rang downstairs, the corridor outside had filled with ordinary inn sounds again, trays and voices, chair legs across boards. The violence of the morning should have dissolved into routine. It did not. It sat in her body as heat and ache and a strange, unsteady alertness, as if one wall in a long familiar room had shifted by an inch, and she could not yet tell what weather now entered. A knock came, rapid and hesitant. Mr. Hale stepped in with his spectacles askew, looked from Ned to Barbara's cheek to the Duke, and chose caution. "The magistrate's clerk is in the front room, Your Grace. He came regarding travel permits and asked whether any incident report from the yard is to be entered." The Duke held out his hand. "Paper." Hale produced a folded sheet and inkwell stopper from his apron pocket, like a conjurer who preferred medicines to magic. The Duke wrote standing, no desk, the script angled and exact. He sanded the line, blew once, and handed the sheet back. "Enter this. Injury by fall under halted carriage. Immediate care rendered by Miss Barbara Nielsen. Surgical attendance by Mr. Turner. Patient stabilized through the night." Barbara looked up sharply. Her name in an incident ledger meant witness beyond this inn. It meant one record not controlled by Mrs. Nielsen's drawing-room voice. It meant fact set down where denial would cost effort. Mrs. Nielsen appeared in the open doorway before she could speak. Her expression took in the paper, the inkwell, Barbara seated beside the hearth with a cloth at her cheek, and tightened to something near panic before smoothing again. "Your Grace, breakfast cools. We are prepared to depart directly after." He did not turn toward her. "You will wait in the parlour." "Sir, This is becoming a spectacle. It became one when you struck her in a public corridor. His tone remained level. Do not mistake my restraint for uncertainty. For the first time since Barbara had known her, Mrs. Nielsen seemed to lose command of language for a full breath. Clara, hovering behind, went pale. Edith's mouth pressed thin with offended disbelief. Mrs. Nielsen recovered enough to curtsy, too shallow to be respectful, too deep to be called refusal. As you wish, Your Grace. When she withdrew, the Duke looked to Ned. Can you travel by noon? Ned nodded, then winced at his own haste. Yes, Your Grace, if I keep the legs straight. You will ride in my carriage with cushions under the calf. No argument. Ned's face changed with relief he tried to hide. Yes, Your Grace. The Duke turned back to Barbara. You will come to the writing-room after breakfast. She stiffened. For what purpose? For accuracy. He glanced toward the corridor where Mrs. Nielsen had gone. You read account books. You know names and dates. I require a clean statement of Captain Nielsen's bond dispute and any transfer orders you have seen. Fear moved through her faster than thought. Not fear of writing. Writing had always been the one place she still belonged to herself. Fear of consequence if those facts left her hand. If I provide that, Mrs. Nielsen will say I have betrayed family. His jaw tightened. The scar at his temple pulled white. If you do not provide it, she keeps using your silence as a document. The truth of it struck clean. She looked down at her wrapped fingers and saw again the double-entered field transfer, the smoothed signature, the vanished receipts, the slap in March when she asked one careful question. Numbers did not bruise, people did. Yet numbers endured longer, if written, where others could read. I will give facts, she said, nothing embellished. I asked for nothing else. He stepped back toward the door, then paused, eyes on her face with that same merciless attention that had first unsettled her in the yard. After you write, you will return to Nielsen House. The words landed like cold water. Return. To attics, withheld meals, closed doors, the careful hand that struck when witnesses were thin. She stood too quickly and gripped the chair back when her ankle flared. No! His gaze sharpened. No! I will not be sent back as if this morning did not occur. I did not say it did not occur. His voice dropped a degree. I said you will return for now. For now is where people are broken. Ned looked between them, frightened by the turn he did not understand. Barbara forced herself to lower her voice. Your Grace, if I go back under her roof after this, she will make me pay for each word spoken in this room. He held her gaze in a silence that felt like standing at a cliff edge in wind. When he answered, each word was distinct. Remain at Nielsen House. I will send for you. Assumption and promise in one line. Authority offered as shelter. Authority still. She tasted iron again at the back of her throat. Old anger and new exhaustion mixing until she could not separate them. Men of rank, send for parcels, she said quietly. Not for women. His expression did not shift, but something in his posture did. A minute stilling at the shoulders as if he had taken a blow and chosen not to show it. Then hear it plainly, he said. I will come myself within 3 days. Until then, you do not leave that house alone. You do not answer creditors at the door. You do not meet any solicitor without my steward present. Command after command, each one barbed with care he would not name otherwise. It should have angered her more than it did. Instead, it left her unsteady, because no one had ever spoken protection over her life in so blunt a register. You presume much, she said. I do. He did not apologize, and I have seen enough to justify it. He looked once to Ned. confirming breath, bandage, consciousness, then back to Barbara's cheek where the mark had begun to fade at the edges. Keep cold cloth to that another hour. He reached to the table, folded a fresh strip of linen, and placed it beside her hand. Do not let her turn this into your shame. He left, without waiting for agreement, Boots receding down the corridor toward the front parlour, where Silk and Pretence waited in the chairs by the fire. Barbara stood motionless in the side room, fingers on the clean linen he had set down, hearing in her own pulse the part that frightened her most. Not that he had commanded, but that for one breath she had wanted to believe him. For one breath she had wanted to believe him. He gave her no chance to hide behind that wanting. Within the hour she sat in the inn, writing room at a narrow walnut desk, while rainwater ticked from the eaves outside and the magistrate's clerk waited with sandshaker and ledger. The Duke stood by the hearth, not seated, his gloves in one hand, the recovered document case on the table beside him with its seal intact. Barbara wrote Captain Nielsen's bond numbers first, then the duplicated transfer order for the Southfield, then the date the signature changed shape. She wrote the names of 2 clerks who had witnessed papers they could not have seen on the day claimed, because one had been in Portsmouth by port log and the other buried 3 weeks earlier. Her hand cramped. She did not stop. When she finished, she blotted the final line and slid the sheet to the clerk. He read, frowned, read again, then copied the statement into the official register in a smaller script, each stroke an anchor. Entered, he said, witnessed at Marlborough. He nodded toward her reddened cheek without comment, and added the incident report number from the corridor assault to the margin. The Duke sealed her original with black wax and his signet, then handed the packet to his steward. Filed with the circuit magistrate at York by express. Receipt returned to Miss Nielsen. He looked at Barbara. You keep your copy. She folded that copy into the lining of her reticule beside the one thing left from her father, a salt-stiff chart cut down to fit. The coach left after noon. This time she rode inside because the Duke opened the door, waited and said only, Seat. Mrs. Nielsen did not speak until the inn had vanished behind hedges and wet stone walls. Then she leaned close, Silk whispering, lavender sharp enough to sting. You mistook a passing intervention for rescue, she said. When we reach home, you will remember what roof you sleep under. Barbara kept her eyes on the road glass. I remember every roof I have slept under. No one spoke for the last 2 miles. On the second morning after Marlborough, Mrs. Nielsen summoned her to the morning room and laid out a marriage contract beside the tea tray, as if it were another household bill. The name at the bottom made Barbara's stomach turn cold. Mr. Pritchard, the creditor who had circled the estate for months with polite threats and wine on his breath, 46, widower, 2 grown sons who laughed at servants, a hand that squeezed too hard when introduced. You will sign at 4, Mrs. Nielsen said. He takes your father's residual claim in exchange for clearing immediate notes. You should be grateful. Barbara read the figures once. They were not a settlement. They were purchase. I will not sign, Mrs. Nielsen smiled without warmth. You will, or I send word that you stole household silver in Marlborough. There is already a report with your name in a magistrate's book. Imagine how useful that will look beside my testimony. The threat was clean and practical. Barbara felt fear rise and settle into something harder. She asked for 1 hour to dress for the solicitor. Mrs. Nielsen granted 30 minutes and posted Edith outside the attic stair. Barbara used 18. She took no silver, no lace, no borrowed shawl. She took her copy of the statement, the chart, a plain dress, and the French grammar Captain Nielsen had bought her at 14. Mrs. Davies from the kitchen met her at the back passage with a wrapped heel of bread, and a look that said more than speech. "There is a carrier cart to Chippenham in 5 minutes, Mrs. C." Davies whispered. "Driver owes me a favour." Barbara gripped her hand once. "If they ask." "I shall say you went for vinegar and did not return, which is true enough." By nightfall she had changed carts twice and traded her surname for a false reference written in Mrs. Davies's careful hand. In York she became Miss Barnes, temporary governess to the daughters of a wool factor on Stonegate. She taught French verbs by candlelight and copied sums after the girls slept. She paid for her room weekly in coins, counted twice. She did not write to Halworth. She did not wait at windows for black falcon crests. 3 days passed before the first reply from Marlborough reached York. It was a folded receipt from the circuit clerk, forwarded through the posting office exactly as the Duke had promised, confirming her statement filed and sealed under case notation for bond fraud review. No letter accompanied it, no command, only proof that one record stood where Mrs. Neilson could not erase it. By the second week of October, York's Charity Assembly opened in the Guildhall with wet cloaks, too many candles, and musicians tuned half a note sharp. Barbara stood near the side dais with the factor's youngest, correcting her posture before a recitation, when she saw Mr. Pritchard cross the hall in dark broadcloth, a packet in his hand and triumph on his face. Beside him walked a frightened boy in ducal morning blue, perhaps 9, thin and stubborn-jawed, trying to pull free. Henry Halworth, the Duke's ward. She knew him from the miniature engraving that had accompanied household notices at Marlborough. Pritchard bowed to the presiding alderman and raised his packet. "Emergency transfer of custodial authority," he announced, "signed and witnessed. The child will be removed to my protection pending debt satisfaction." The hall quieted in that ugly way crowds do when cruelty is dressed as law. Henry's mouth tightened. He did not cry. Barbara moved before calculation could catch her. She stepped into the aisle, hands cold, voice carrying farther than she expected. "That signature is false." Every head turned. Pritchard blinked once, then smiled when he recognised her. "Miss Neilson, or whatever name you sell this week." She did not answer him. She addressed the alderman. "The date on that transfer cannot stand. The witness named Elias Trent died prior to it. The account notation references Bond Ledger C, Folio 19. That folio was closed 2 months earlier under maritime settlement terms. I copied those entries myself." Pritchard lifted the page higher. "And who are you to contradict stamped paper?" "The daughter of Captain Neilson," she said, "whose bond you have tried to buy through coercion twice. I know the hand, I know the ink clerk, I know which seal chip's at the lower edge, because it was cracked in summer heat." A murmur moved through the room. The alderman held out his hand for the packet. Pritchard hesitated, then surrendered it with visible reluctance. The alderman read. His brows drew down. "Fetch the magistrate from the retiring room." Bootsteps sounded at the far doors before the beadle could move. The Duke of Halworth entered with 2 legal officers, and Ned Carrow, pale but upright, his legs stiff in a brace. Rain darkened the Duke's greatcoat. He did not scan the crowd. He looked directly at Barbara, as if the line between them had never broken across counties and lies. He came to stand beside her and spoke without raising his voice. "You were right to run from me. You were wrong to think you ran alone." Her hands began to shake then, not from fear alone. He did not touch her. He stood still enough for her to borrow steadiness from the shape of him. Mrs. Neilson swept in from the opposite entrance, at that exact moment, out of breath, Clara and Edith behind her, in travel silk gone creased from haste. She pointed at Barbara before she had fully stopped moving. "She stole documents and money from my house," she said to the room. "She is unstable. She invents figures." Clara looked at Barbara once, and then at the floor. She never looked up again. Edith opened her mouth as if to add something sharp, then closed it, when Ned stepped forward and placed the recovered Marlborough document case on the magistrate's table. "Original custody instruments, intact seal," Ned said clearly. "Preserved under wheel on Holworth order." The magistrate, the same circuit official named on Barbara's receipt, broke the seal, checked the papers against Pritchard's packet, and asked for the bond file brought by the Duke's steward. It was produced at once. Captain Nielsen's original maritime settlement, Mrs. Nielsen's transfer orders, and 2 overlays in different ink where numbers had been altered. Barbara watched his eyes move line by line, watched his jaw set. He looked up. Fraud. Coercive misrepresentation of custody, fabrication of transfer instruments. Mrs. Nielsen stepped back as if the words were physical. "You cannot mean to—" "I do," he signalled the officers. "Mrs. Nielsen, Mr. Pritchard, you are to be held pending formal charge." "No," Mrs. Nielsen said. It came out small. The officers did not argue. They escorted both from the hall under warrant, while guests who had once watched Barbara limp in rain now watched her stand with ink under her fingernails and law at her side. Edith stared after her mother with naked disbelief. Clara, passing Barbara, whispered, "I never wanted this," and kept walking. It was the only truth she offered, and the only one she ever did. When the hall thinned and candles burned lower, Henry Holworth took Barbara's hand with a solemn care. "You did not let him take me?" "No," she said, "I did not." The Duke dismissed the last of his officers and turned to her near the empty musicians' chairs. Rain tapped the high windows. Her pulse had not slowed. She asked very quietly, "Does it hurt to command when you mean to ask?" For a moment he could not answer. Then he removed his signet ring, set it on the table between them, and spoke with none of the steel he used for rooms full of men. "Barbara Nielsen, will you marry me? With your terms written first, and mine second." She held his gaze. "Joint control of my inheritance, legal protection and schooling for Henry, Mrs. Davies retained in comfort, and you do not silence me when my numbers contradict your certainty." "Agreed," he said, "all of it." "Put it in writing." "It is already drafted." His steward stepped forward from the doorway with a packet prepared, as if he had learned that her trust began where paper began. They sat at the alderman's table and wrote each clause by candlelight. She signed only after reading every line. He signed after her, then pressed his seal beneath both names. They were married in York 3 days later, under special licence in a chapel that smelled of stone and beeswax. Henry stood between them with a new cravat and a heeled leg. Mrs. Davies cried quietly into a clean apron in the back pew. Barbara wore no pearls. She wore her own plain gloves, mended at the thumb, and the chart paper folded over her heart. On the first morning at Holworth House, she unlocked the estate ledger room with her own key, while dawn came grey over the lawns. The Duke entered, paused on the threshold and waited. "May I come in?" he asked. She looked up from the open account book, ink fresh on her pen, and nodded once. "Yes, ask and come in."